The American Civil War was the deadliest war in American history. In just a 4-year period, from 1861 to 1865, over 600,000 Americans lost their lives, 50% more than that of those who died in World War II. Fort Stevens was one of 144 military forts used during the Civil War. Fully completed in 1865 on the Clatsop Spit, facing the mouth of the Columbia River. It, along with Fort Canby in Washington state, was meant to protect the North against an English invasion from Canada, out of fear of the British joining the Confederates. At the time, the fort was known as the Fort of Point Adams. It was later renamed in honor of former Washington Territory Governor Isaac Stevens, who was killed at the Battle of Chantilly in 1862. During the war, the fort was an open earthen fort known as an earthworks. It was armed with 26 guns placed within 7 batteries, 17 of which were massive Rodman cannons. The largest of these was a 15-inch, 50,000-pound cannon that fired a 315-pound projectile that had a range of 3,500 yards. These cannons were considered to be the most powerful and accurate of their time. Also, to help protect the shoreline, there were 2 more small-caliber rapid-fire batteries and minefields. Fortunately, neither Fort Stevens nor Fort Canby ever saw combat, nor even fired a single shot, for the war had ended just a few months later. After the Civil War, Fort Stevens remained active, and in 1897, as part of a nationwide coastal defense program, was upgraded with 8 concrete batteries, which held mortars and various long and short-range rifles. After World War I, radio communications were placed at the fort to keep in contact with the fleet. Then in 1932, a secret radio intercept station was placed to listen in on coded Japanese naval messages. Fort Stevens reached its peak of activity during World War II, when approximately 2,500 men were stationed there. To house all of the soldiers, new barracks were constructed. In the place of the Rodman cannons were now massive 6-inch rifles and a 155mm anti-aircraft gun, which was never fired. Mines were also placed in the ocean not far from the shore to avoid attacks by sea. The fort was armed to the teeth and prepared for the worst. Then on the night of June 21st, 1942, the worst arrived. A Japanese B-1 class submarine named I-25 with a crew of 97 entered the mouth of the Columbia and pointed its 5.5-inch caliber deck gun at the fort and opened fire. The commander of the submarine ordered the crew to follow the fishing vessels into the river to avoid the minefields. The fort responded with full power, but unfortunately, the submarine was too far out of range. 17 shells were fired at the fort, but thankfully, no one was anywhere near the area of the bombardment, and the fort suffered no casualties. And the only part of the fort that was significantly damaged was a football field and some telephone cables. The submarine managed to escape the line of fire and was never seen again. Even though there were no casualties and very little damage done, this attack was enough to cause the United States military to prepare for a full-scale invasion. Miles of barbed wire were strung out along the coasts of Oregon, where they remained until the end of the war. This attack took place just 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor and was the only attack from a foreign force that occurred on the mainland. This was also the first attack on any military installation from an enemy force since the War of 1812. In 1944, the Battery 245 was constructed. It was meant to upgrade the defenses for the harbor. It was originally armed with 2 6-inch turret rifles. These were the most modern guns ever installed at the fort. but they were eventually replaced with 5-inch rifles, the ones you see in this image. In 1947, 2 years after the end of the war, Fort Stevens was decommissioned. All the original armaments were removed, and all the buildings were auctioned off. The grounds were then transferred to the United States Army Corps of Engineers until 1975, when it was finally handed over to the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department and became a state park. Today, Fort Stevens State Park is one of the most visited parks in Oregon, attracting more than 1 million visitors a year. Forts Canby and Columbia across the harbor are now state parks as well. Fort Stevens was an active military installation for 84 years. Now it is merely a ghostly yet beautiful reminder of our once dark past and the brutal inhumanity of war. The Peter Iredale was a large cargo ship known as a bark that was built in the small English town of Maryport in June of 1890. The ship was built by R. Ritson and Company for the fleet of the British shipping company P. Iredale and Porter, for which she was named after. The ship was fashioned from steel plates that sat on a thick iron frame. At 285 feet long and with a net register weight of 2,075 tons, the Peter Iredale was the largest ship ever built by R. Ritson. The ship had a crew of 27 and was captained by G.A. Brown and later by H. Lawrence. After 8 successful voyages to the West Coast, she then set off from Salina Cruz, Mexico on September 26, 1906, bound for Portland, where a load of wheat meant for the British market was waiting, along with 2 unidentified stowaways. This would be her final voyage. Then on October 25th at 3:20 a.m., Captain Lawrence spotted the Tillamook Rock Lighthouse and ordered a change of course. It was at this moment that her fate was sealed. The ship sailed into thick fog, heavy winds, and a rising tide. Perfect conditions for disaster. After several hours of trying to navigate through the harsh weather, a strong gust of wind from the northwest pushed the ship too close to the shore, and at 7:45 a.m., the ship slammed onto the beach of the Clatsop Spit. A distress signal was sent out, and soon after, a lifeboat was sent from the town of Hammond to assist with an evacuation. Fortunately, despite the harsh weather conditions, all 27 crewmen and the 2 stowaways survived the incident and were all uninjured. The ship, however, was not quite as fortunate. Little damage was done to the ship's hull, but 3 of her 4 masts had split and all of her sails were torn. One member of the rescue team recalls Captain Lawrence standing up and saluting his fallen ship. His final words to her were, "May God bless you, and may your bones bleach the sands." He then turned to his men, pulled out a bottle of whiskey from his pocket, and said, "Boys, have a drink." Plans to attempt to tow the ship back to England were made, but after weeks of unsavory weather conditions, as well as the ship slowly being consumed by the sands, any idea of saving her was abandoned. Eventually, the ship began to list and a massive gash had opened on her starboard side, nearly splitting her in half. On November 12th and 13th, an inquiry was held in Astoria by the British Naval Court to determine who or what was responsible for the incident. It was later determined that the crew were not at fault, and the court stated that the captain and his officers were, said as quoted, in no wise to blame. 11 years later, in 1917, the rights to salvage the ship were sold. Surprisingly, however, the ship was never touched. Not until World War II, when small sections of the hull were salvaged for the war effort. All of the years after the wreck were uneventful until the night of June 21st, 1942, when a B-1 class Japanese submarine fired several artillery shells at Fort Stevens. Despite being in the direct line of fire, the ship was never hit. The next day, rolls of barbed wire were strung out along the coast to prevent invasion. And to protect the ship, more barbed wire was wrapped around her hull, where it remained until the end of the war. Throughout the years, the wreck of the Peter Iredale has become a major tourist attraction and has still remained unsalvaged. Her rudder was donated to the Columbia River Maritime Museum in Astoria, where it remains to this day. Now, 118 years later, this is all that remains of the once magnificent ship. The skeletal remains of the Peter Iredale are a stark reminder of just how merciless the seas can be. Her crew cheated death, but many others have not had the same luxury. This was not the only shipwreck that occurred in the waters of the Pacific Northwest. A 450-mile stretch of coastline from Tillamook Bay, Oregon, to Cape Scott of Vancouver Island, British Columbia, is considered to be one of the most treacherous sections of the entire Pacific Ocean. This stretch is known as the Graveyard of the Pacific. And these are some of the many ships that have met with the same grim fate as that of the Peter Iredale.